Maureen Brainerd Barnes was 25. She answered to friends who remembered her smile, a woman who sometimes worked two jobs and who loved her children in a way that made every decision she made feel urgent and human. She was a daughter, a late-night caller to a worried mother, a neighbor who kept her car clean and paid her bills with quiet determination. The name Maureen Brainerd Barnes would one day be stitched into a list of victims discovered along a lonely stretch of Ocean Parkway, 3 words that to some would become a code in a mystery that tangled police, families, and a community for more than a decade. Please help this channel grow, like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. But before those headlines, she existed as a life lived. Small routines, favorite songs, someone's laughter floating down a kitchen hallway. This story begins there with a person whose plans and promises were stolen before they were exhausted. And it ends with a man who, for decades, blended into the suburban landscape. An architect with a house on a tidy block, someone neighbors waved to on the way to the train. How did a neighbor become the prime suspect in one of Long Island's most haunting mysteries? Gilgo Beach is not a place most people think of as sinister. It is a stretch of dunes and wind and the kind of ocean air that evaporates nervous energy. But along the remote shoulders of Ocean Parkway, police discovered, beginning in 2010, evidence of something darker. The remains of multiple women, wrapped, left, and hidden where the highway met sand and scrub. The discovery would awaken a sprawling, decades-long investigation into what came to be called the Gilgo Beach murders. Over the years, investigators linked a number of women found along and near Gilgo Beach, now often referenced as the Gilgo Four, among others. Names that the public would learn became, in turn, people with histories. Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Lynn Costello, Maureen Brainerd Barnes. Women whose lives intersected with the vulnerabilities of surviving on the margins, some of whom used online services to find work or company. Later investigative work and new forensic testing extended the timeline even further back, and additional victims were added to the overlay of time and loss. Each identification was a human story reclaimed from anonymity. Rex Andrew Heuermann, born in 1963, a Manhattan architect who lived for years in Massapequa Park on Long Island. To neighbors and clients he was an unremarkable figure. A professional, a husband, a father. That ordinariness is part of what made the case so jarring. The idea that someone who appeared to be a conventional suburban man could be at the center of such brutal allegations. In July 2023, Heuermann was arrested and charged in connection with multiple Gilgo Beach area murders. He has pleaded not guilty. Public indictments and court filings allege that Heuermann was involved in the deaths of multiple women spanning years, and some filings extending back to the early 1990s and reaching through 2010. Some of the strongest allegations rely on advanced DNA testing, cell phone records, witness statements, and a web of circumstantial evidence that prosecutors say, when combined, form a clear narrative of culpability. The defense has contested the scientific methods and moved to exclude evidence. Heuermann maintains his innocence. These legal moves would shape the story as much as any forensic discovery. When the first remains were discovered in December 2010, the discovery was not a single headline but the beginning of a slow cascade. Bodies were found in burlap sacks and hidden in areas where few people stopped. The places the bodies were left were deliberate, remote, near stretches of road but far enough away to avoid casual discovery. For the families who would later learn their loved ones were among those remains, the discovery was an impossible question mark. Who could do this? And why? The victims discovered in patches of sand, a ditch, a curve in the road had in common fragments of handling, removed clothing, bindings or wrappings of similar materials, and the same disregard for being seen. To investigators and behavioral analysts, patterns began to form, not as comforts, but as clues. A killer who disposed of bodies along certain corridors, a dark familiarity with Long Island's back roads, a pattern that suggested methodical planning. The physical details are grisly, but what matters most, and what we show, is the human cost. Lives interrupted, conversations cut off, birthdays never celebrated. One critical piece of the unfolding narrative is the way the crimes were discovered not by a single witness but by time, by the attrition of evidence across years, and by families who refused to let names vanish. As those small discoveries stacked, investigators began to suspect they were looking at not random tragedies but the work of a single individual or a small group, organized enough to strike and vanish. That suspicion would harden into a theory of a serial offender. In the immediate aftermath of the 2010 discoveries, investigators worked through leads that ranged from eyewitness accounts to anonymous tips. The case, however, faced the kind of friction that stretches cold cases thin. jurisdictional boundaries, the difficulties of connecting transient lifestyles and sex work economies to missing persons reports, and the limits of forensic technology at the time. 4 years the case sat, active but unsolved, a roster of questions waiting for better tools. Investigators never truly stopped. As forensic science evolved, so did the case. Cell phone tower data, once only a crude hint, became a digital breadcrumb trail. Phone records placed devices near dump sites or connected lines used to contact victims. Investigators used geolocation, call logs, and the growing forensic power of DNA sequencing to re-examine evidence held in storage for years. In some cases, new testing linked hairs or fibers to genetic markers that were previously untestable. These technological advances began to bridge the gap between the crime scenes and real people. One detail that has become emblematic of the modern cold case turnaround is almost mundane: a discarded pizza crust. Prosecutors have said that DNA collected from a pizza crust linked to Heuermann matched DNA found in hair recovered from a victim's body. That match, first reported publicly after Heuermann's arrest, provided investigators with a biological tie that brought a suspect's world into the scope of evidence, turning a neighborhood routine into a forensic breadcrumb. Prosecutors also later obtained a cheek swab from Heuermann that corroborated the earlier match, evidence they called highly persuasive. The defense has challenged both the methods used and the underlying lab procedures, but to many, the pizza crust was the point at which suspicion hardened into accusation. Beyond DNA, witnesses reported seeing a green Chevrolet Avalanche associated with one of the victims, and that vehicle was later connected to Heuermann by investigators. Other evidence included financial records, online searches, and patterns of movement that prosecutors say placed Heuermann in proximity to some victims around the time they disappeared. Together, these disparate elements, digital footprints, material evidence, and witness statements drew a line from the scenes to an individual who had once been simply another man on a suburban street. For families who lived with unanswered questions, each step of the investigation mattered in a visceral way. An identification was not merely a forensic achievement, it was a moment that allowed a family to grieve with a name instead of a number. It also reopened wounds, offered testimony, and forced survivors to re-walk paths they had tried to close. The investigation, slow and sometimes halting, exacted a social price. Neighborhoods that once felt safe began re-examining what they thought they knew about the people who lived there. On July 13, 2023, Rex Heuermann was arrested and charged in connection with the deaths of 3 women: Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello, whose remains were found near Gilgo Beach. Prosecutors later expanded those charges to include additional victims, with indictments alleging his involvement across a span of years. Heuermann pleaded not guilty to the charges and was held without bail. A central axis of pre-trial litigation has been the admissibility of advanced DNA techniques. Prosecutors have introduced results from whole genome sequencing and other modern molecular methods, arguing that these tests link Heuermann to hair and biological material recovered from multiple victims. The defense has pushed back hard, arguing that some of the labs and methods have not been validated under New York law and that the results could be unreliable or improperly handled. Judges have been tasked with the delicate balance of allowing cutting-edge science which can provide clarity while ensuring that admitted evidence meets standards of reliability and fairness. Court rulings so far have allowed significant DNA evidence to be presented at trial, a consequential decision that prosecutors hailed as a major victory. Heuermann's defense sought to split the cases, arguing that trying all charges together would be prejudicial. Prosecutors, on the other hand, argued the interconnected nature of the evidence made a combined trial appropriate. In later rulings, judges opted to keep the charges consolidated, finding that much of the evidence overlapped and that the interest of justice was best served by a single proceeding. These rulings shaped the way the narrative could be presented to a jury as a pattern rather than isolated tragedies. The Heuermann case is a legal milestone not only for the families but for forensic practice. Admitting whole genome sequencing and other novel DNA techniques in a high-profile criminal case carries implications for many other cold cases. If the science is accepted, it may unlock new paths for solving crimes where older methods failed. If excluded, prosecutors will remain constrained to older, perhaps less sensitive techniques. That tension between scientific progress and judicial gatekeeping has made the courtroom a second crime scene, one where facts and method are excavated under intense scrutiny. For the families of victims, the proceedings have been bittersweet. Each hearing and each admission of evidence is a step toward accountability, but legal process is not the same as closure. The families continue to live with grief that is both private and public, their pain amplified by the spotlight. For neighbors whose lives seemed ordinary, The revelation that a suburban resident could be the target of such accusations has seeded a cautious re-examination of trust and normalcy. The community's narrative, the story of where they live and who they are, is forever altered. Beyond the local impact, the case stands as a possible template for how cold cases are reopened in the genomic era. The use of advanced DNA science, combined with digital forensics and persistent investigative work, demonstrates both the power and the pitfalls of modern detection. If convictions are obtained, other cases may be re-examined with renewed vigor. If challenges to evidence succeed, prosecutors nationwide will take note of the limits imposed by courts. Either way, this legal contest marks an inflection point in criminal justice. There is a particular cruelty in being invisible in life and visible only in death. The women at the center of the Gilgo Beach investigation, Maureen Brainerd Barnes among them, were not statistics waiting for a file number. They were names spoken in kitchens and held in the silence of phone calls that never came. 4 years their stories were missing chapters, and for even longer their families waited for pages to be found. When science, persistence, and chance converge in a pizza crust, in a phone log, in a tire track, the law may be able to assemble a narrative that looks like justice. But justice, in the raw sense, is complicated. It can arrive late, it can be imperfect, and it can never fully return what was lost. Our job as storytellers is not to bask in the horror but to insist on the humanity. We show faces not to frighten but to remember. Tonight, a man who once blended into a tidy neighborhood sits under the weight of grave accusations. The courts will sort fact from contention, and a jury will decide under the rules of law. Meanwhile, the people who love the victims will continue, as they always have, to hold their memories like a fragile lamp against the dark. If there is a final lesson from this fall from suburb to suspect, it is this: that evil, when it hides in daylight, can be just as terrifying as evil that lurks in shadows. And that sometimes, the smallest of things, a crust of pizza, a phone ping, can begin to pull a thread so long and frayed it unravels a mystery. For the families, for the neighbors, for all of us who try in our limited ways to honor the dead, the work continues. To remember, to seek truth, and to demand that the stories of the lost be told with dignity.